Hi, my name is Christina Sloan, and thank you for viewing my presentation today. The title of my research is The Impact of Implementing Social-Emotional Learning in a First Grade Classroom with Multiple Tiered Behaviors. I became interested in this topic after my first year of teaching in a Title I school district in 2019. Throughout my experience of working in a Title I schools, I noticed that there are many severe and higher tiered behavior concerns in the classrooms. Many teachers are unprepared or have minimal training to work with students displaying these types of behaviors. Many of the students in these schools come from lower income minority families, and unfortunately, many of them also experience an array of traumas in their home lives. Because of this, I wanted to take a deeper look into social emotional learning and mindfulness interventions and find out if there was a specific strategy to help those students with higher tiered behavioral concerns. For my research question, I wanted to find out how the implementation of social-emotional learning affects multiple tiered student behaviors when implemented in a first grade classroom. Throughout my research into previous social-emotional learning and mindfulness strategies that have been used both successfully and unsuccessfully in the classroom, I discovered 4 common themes. These included stakeholder buy-in, teacher preparedness, intervention continuation, and multiple tiered behaviors. The first theme was stakeholder buy-in. Throughout the research, studies with the most success with social-emotional learning had school and parent buy-in. This buy-in from the school and parents helps ensure that there is a continuation of the interventions from the school setting to the home setting, as well as throughout the grade level and subject classes throughout the school. The second theme I found was teacher preparedness. Programs with increased funding and professional training directed towards its teachers were typically most successful. This was especially true in schools that served a higher population of cultural and linguistically diverse students. The third theme was lack of data on intervention continuation. Consistently, limitations to studies looking into social-emotional learning and mindfulness strategies included the length of implementation of these intervention programs and strategies. Although much of the research that has been completed is longitudinal, often there is not enough information to determine how effective these SEL interventions are long-term after an extended period of time. Finally, the last theme was the effectiveness of the social-emotional learning, or SEL, and mindfulness interventions on multiple tiered behaviors. Throughout the research on SEL and mindfulness and restorative practices, a common theme arose that correlated with the level of behavior most affected by these interventions. Often, social-emotional learning interventions were more successful with students at a lower to medium tiered behavior and less effective with higher level and aggressive behaviors. As for my own research, I wanted to look specifically at how these interventions would work in my classroom, as well as my own ability to implement the interventions successfully, consistently, and in an unbiased manner. There were 25 students in a first grade classroom aged 6 to 7 years old, and the school was a Title I charter school in central Glendale, Arizona. This is a kindergarten through 8th grade campus, and although the kindergarten through 2nd grade classrooms are ideally isolated from the older students, the younger students still have great exposure to some of the more mature behavior that is displayed around the campus by the older students. We also have a primarily Latinx student population with many English language learners and parents who are Spanish speaking only. This often makes communication a huge barrier when dealing with student behavior concerns at our school. The interventions that I chose to implement included a series of breathing, yoga, and stretching exercises interjected throughout the school day. Inclusion of social-emotional learning picture books with accompanying discussions and activities, which were supplemented in our reading curriculum, and implementing an individualized behavior clip chart tracker for students to use throughout the day. The data was primarily observational, although I conducted a self-assessment survey to identify student perceptions of SEL learning themes prior to implementing the interventions, and then again at the end of the intervention period. The behavior clip chart is part of a school-wide PBIS strategy, but I individualized the clip charts so each student had an individualized chart on their desk to keep the behavior tracking discrete and between myself and the student. I also assigned a numeric value to each color on the behavior clip chart and marked the student behavior daily on a checkout sheet to determine any changes in behavior throughout the 8-week intervention period. I kept an observation journal to track student behavior throughout the intervention period. The observation chart included the student identification trigger, the trigger leading to the behavior, and severity of the behavior, as well as which strategy was used to de-escalate the behavior and if it was successful. I also kept a parent call log to track both positive and negative calls home, as well as our school-wide referral tracker to identify which, if any, students were given referrals during that intervention period. The Social Emotional Learning Survey served as a baseline data to track student perception of SEL and mindfulness at the beginning of the intervention period and then again at the end of the 8-week period. After conducting the pre-self-assessment survey, I determined that I needed to make some changes to the format of the questionnaire as well as my own methods for administering the survey to the class. The students were overwhelmed with the amount of questions, the lack of numbering, and wording of particular questions on the survey. After reflecting on this, I decided to spread out the physical layout of the questionnaire, add pictures to aid the visual learners in my class, and number my questions so students could more easily follow along as I gave the survey. I also required students to put up privacy folders to ensure their responses were anonymous and so they would feel more comfortable about responding honestly to the survey questions. The research data was primarily observational. It was inconclusive which strategies were most successful in decreasing aggressive or defiant behaviors. The primary strategy that was used in the intervention period were mindfulness techniques such as breathing exercises, stretching, and yoga exercises. The specific SEL learning literature and accompanying activities were helpful in facilitating important conversations around emotions and conflict resolution. However, I found that the most immediate effect to combat those higher tiered behaviors was from the mindfulness exercises. The breathing, yoga, and stretching exercises were also the most favored and requested by the students throughout the intervention period. The clip chart data was not very reliable. After reflecting on the clip chart feedback, I determined that this data was not very helpful because the goal of the clip charts is for students to end their day on the highest acceptable behavior. And since this is a school-wide PBIS tool, the teachers are encouraged to make sure students are on one of the top 2 colors by the end of the day, even if students were requested to clip down or if there was parent contact made. So it's a great tool for reinforcing positive behaviors. However, I didn't feel that it showed accurate data for which specific intervention strategies were most successful in diffusing behavior in the classroom during this period. Throughout the 8-week intervention period, almost every student benefited from the mindfulness exercises. Only one student had an escalation of negative behavior during this period. This student received 2 suspensions during the intervention period for showing aggressive behavior towards other students as well as myself and other faculty. And they also received 5 disciplinary referrals for aggression, defiance, and being unkind towards others in the classroom. After analyzing the pre and post self-assessment surveys, the results of the surveys showed that there was little change between the student responses from the beginning to the end of the intervention period. There were 3 questions from the survey which I have highlighted or I have circled in red on both the initial and post-assessment survey. And these were the only 3 questions where I noted any significant change in the student answers. And those questions were related directly to the mindfulness strategies and techniques that were used by students to calm themselves. I believe that this result is pretty accurate because as a whole, the class mostly benefited from breathing, yoga, stretching exercises that they completed during transitions, between lessons, and then just whenever I felt that the students needed a break. These calming breaks directly impacted students' ability to engage and focus in a lesson. So if I noticed that the students were not participating, they didn't seem to be engaged, or I noticed that some behaviors were beginning to escalate during my teaching, I would pause the lesson, give one of these calming breaks, and then almost always I would see an immediate effect of the student behavior kind of reducing, fixing itself, and students being much more engaged in the lesson. Although student perception around SEL learning did not vary greatly during the 8-week period. I did observe that students were much more comfortable in talking about their emotions and attempting to problem solve conflicts independently. I used multiple I observed multiple situations where students attempted to discuss their feelings about a conflict, and I also witnessed students apologizing or resolving a conflict amongst themselves without seeking out a teacher myself to help them solve that problem. For future research, I would like to extend the amount of time where the interventions are implemented in the classroom. It would also be greatly beneficial to extend the post-intervention period to see if mindfulness strategies can be consistently carried on throughout the entire school year and still have the same positive effect on the students. Future studies will also hopefully be outside of COVID restrictions where the classroom environment is not so limiting. The students started the school year virtually, then we transitioned to in-person learning with many, many restrictions, which added stress and anxiety um, for both the students and also the faculty and staff at the school. And it also limited some of the mindfulness interventions and the way that I was able to do those activities with the class. There was also a high turnover of students during this 8-week period, so I would like to have a consistent population of students when conducting this research in the future.